Here begins the story. On a wind-swept afternoon, the hills of Galilee stood quiet beneath a bruised sky. Olive trees rustled softly, as if straining to listen. The distant sea glinted like hammered silver, reflecting a world that was waiting. It was not a holy day. There was no festival, no official gathering. And yet they came. Farmers with cracked hands and tired backs. Mothers holding swaddled infants close to their chest. Zealots with fire in their bones. Beggars whispering the same prayer they had repeated for years. And among them, a blind man led by a child no older than 10, his steps unsure, but his heart unshakable. They had come for one reason, not for spectacle, not for promises of freedom from Rome, but for the carpenter, a man from Nazareth, not a rabbi like the others, not a scholar with scrolls, not a revolutionary with swords, just a man who healed with spit and dust, who touched the untouchables, who spoke like someone who had seen the beginning. The blind man had met him once, or rather, heard him. A voice like dawn breaking through fog, hands calloused from labor, but infinitely gentle. He remembered the silence before the command, "See." But what opened that day was not the eyes, it was the spirit. It was light without form, presence without vision. And now he returned, not to be healed again, but to hear, to know. The crowd stirred, no trumpet, no banner, just a man ascending the hill robe, brushing the earth eyes like still water. He sat, no throne beneath him, no platform to elevate, only a rock, and the hush of hearts leaning forward. And then he opened his mouth. If you hunger for truth that still speaks, stay with us. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom. Let the hills of Galilee echo in your soul. He opened his mouth, and with that something ancient broke. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with a word that fell like soft rain on parched ground. Blessed. That single word, it was not a command. It was not even a promise. It was a revelation. The crowd did not cheer. They stilled, as if their souls, long exiled, had been called home. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he said, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Somewhere behind the blind man, a mother stifled a cry. She had sold everything to bury her third child, and now she was blessed. A fisherman let the net fall from his hands. His debts outweighed his catch, and he was among the heirs of heaven. It didn't make sense, but it didn't need to. Because in that moment, the rules of the world, the silent calculus of worth and power, cracked like dry earth under sudden rain. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The blind man's hands curled in his lap. He remembered the years, the darkness, the laughter of others as he stumbled. He had mourned the life he never had. And yet the voice called him blessed, not because of what he had, but because of what had been awakened in him. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. A Roman soldier shifted his weight near the edge of the crowd. He had conquered villages with iron, and now he heard that the earth, this very ground, belonged not to men like him, but to the gentle, the yielded, the obedient. The words fell one by one like chisel strikes on marble. They did not merely comfort, they redefined. Strength was no longer domination, it was surrender. Wealth was not possession, it was hunger for righteousness. The kingdom of heaven did not begin with victory. It began with need. And as the blind man listened, he realized something else. These blessings weren't rewards for those who had achieved. They were invitations for those who had nothing left. He continued. No hesitation, no effort to persuade. Only a steady unfolding of a reality long hidden beneath the noise of the world. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. In the distance, a man clenched a worn coin pouch to his chest. His hands trembled not from age, but from a hunger that no bread could fill. Not a hunger for food, but for something just, something holy. The blind man, still listening, breathed slowly. He had once begged beneath the walls of a temple, hearing prayers, but never belonging. Now he felt like he stood inside something sacred, though his feet never moved. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Somewhere behind him, a girl who had been cast out for her shame lowered her head. She had no name in that crowd, only glances, whispers. But this man, the one sitting on stone, was speaking as if mercy was not earned, but given. Not won by worthiness, but chosen by grace. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And now the blind man smiled. He had no eyes for the sky, but his heart had begun to see. And perhaps he wondered that had always been the point. These words, simple, gentle, unarmed, had the power to undo empires. Not by force, but by revealing something unshakable, that the truest power is purity. The truest victory is mercy, and the truest inheritance is not gold or land, but a kingdom not made by hands. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. The blind man reached for the child beside him and whispered, "Did you hear that?" And the boy, too young to grasp it all, nodded. He had heard something in the man's voice that he couldn't explain. Something that felt like home. Something that tasted like forever. What if the people we forget are the very ones heaven remembers first? The man on the rock did not pause. His words flowed not like debate, but like prophecy. Not ideas, but fire. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Persecuted. The crowd stirred. Some exchanged looks. Others clenched their jaws. A few lowered their heads in quiet recognition. The blind man did not move. He knew what it meant to be dismissed, to be stepped around, avoided, reduced to silence. But this was different. Jesus was not offering escape. He was declaring blessing in the very place the world offered shame. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not the temples, not Caesar's, not the priesthoods, but theirs. The forgotten, the refused. And suddenly the sermon was no longer gentle. It was defiant. Like seeds cracking through stone, the truth pressed upward. It grew in the silence, in the scandal, in the way it turned every system upside down. Blessed are the weeping. Blessed are the broken. Blessed are the bruised. It was a gospel that looked nothing like glory, and yet carried more glory than empires ever knew. A woman stood near the edge of the crowd, holding the shawl tighter around her head. Her son had died in the night, the fever too quick, too cruel. And yet, when the carpenter spoke of comfort, she felt her soul rise, not to demand answers, but to receive presence. That was his power. He did not erase suffering. He entered it, and by doing so, made it sacred. The blind man swallowed hard. This was not the religion he grew up with. It was not rules. It was reversal. A holy inversion in which the last are seen first, and the ones who bleed are not blamed, but blessed. Could it be that every wound is already known and already seen from the throne of heaven? The words of Jesus lingered, not like echoes, but like seeds settling deep. He looked at the crowd, their hunger unspoken, their hearts brittle from religion and empire. And then he said something that pierced deeper than law or legend. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Rejoice, glad. The woman with no child, the man whose taxes had swallowed his field, the boy born of shame hiding behind his mother's veil. How could they rejoice? But Jesus wasn't speaking to their circumstances. He was speaking to their calling. You are the light of the world, he said next. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. And suddenly the metaphor moved like thunder across the valley. The blind man blinked. He could not see the crowd, but he could feel them shifting, restless, awakened. A city. He had lived his life in alleys and shadows. Now this man, this carpenter, was telling him he was made to shine. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus said. But if the salt loses its flavor, how can it be made salty again? The blind man smiled faintly. Flavor, light, meaning. No longer just surviving. Now, carrying something eternal. That was the miracle. Not just the healing of bodies, but the restoration of purpose. Not just comfort in pain, but identity in the storm. A light set on a hill. A presence that made blandness holy again. And he didn't ask for credentials, didn't separate the clean from the unclean. He simply declared, "You, yes, you beggar, mother rebel widow. You are what the world forgot it needed." What if the very ones the world calls invisible are the ones God calls luminous? The crowd was still absorbing the light. Then came the shock. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets," Jesus said. "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." A ripple moved through the listeners. The law was sacred. It was the mountain with Moses. It was the fire and thunder, the stone and the command. It was identity. And here was this man, sitting without scrolls, without lineage, without title, declaring he had come not to set aside the ancient ways, but to complete them. The blind man's breath caught. Not because he was offended, but because something in him understood. This was not subtraction. It was culmination. Jesus wasn't breaking the old foundation. He was revealing what had always been hidden beneath it. "You have heard that it was said to those of old," Jesus continued, "You shall not murder. But I say to you." The word stopped time. But I say to you. It wasn't just interpretation. It was authority. Jesus wasn't quoting. He was speaking as the origin of truth. And what he revealed was terrifying in its clarity. It wasn't the act of murder that defiled. It was the anger that fed it. The slow, seething bitterness that grew beneath silence. The quiet insult, the muttered curse, the unseen resentment that too was violence. It wasn't just about hands. It was about hearts. Not just behavior, but roots. Not just command, but motive. The blind man bowed his head. He had never struck a man, but he had hated, had whispered judgment in his own mind. And now his soul stood exposed. Jesus wasn't creating a new law. He was uncovering the soul of the old one. What if righteousness isn't about what we avoid, but about what we carry inside us in the silence where no one else looks? The silence grew deeper, not empty, but expectant. And then Jesus spoke again. "You have heard it said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart." The words dropped like a stone into still water. No scream, no shout, just a ripple that reached everyone. A merchant lowered his eyes. A young man turned his face to the ground. A husband squeezed his wife's hand as if afraid she might drift away. Jesus had gone past the border of sin. He had entered the country of the heart. The blind man felt it too. He could not see faces, but he remembered how his thoughts could still wander, how desire could live even in darkness. And now he realized purity was not about avoiding the act. It was about watching the inner gaze. The world said, "If your hands are clean, you are clean." But Jesus said, "If your heart is diseased, no ritual can cure you." Then came the words that left no room for compromise. "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off." No one moved, because no one misunderstood. He wasn't asking for mutilation. He was calling for sacrifice, for holy surgery, for choosing heaven over habit, cutting ties with the thing that slowly strangles your soul. The blind man breathed in slow and trembling. What would he have to cut? What had become comfortable but corrosive? Jesus was not raising the bar to crush them. He was raising their eyes to what they were made for. And sometimes the way to life is through loss. What if the sin that seems small today was always meant to be removed before it quietly devours everything sacred? The next words were quieter, but no less cutting. "You have heard it said, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I say to you, do not swear at all." The people blinked. In a world where oaths were currency, where men swore by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, this was disarming. No vows, no sacred promises. But Jesus was not banishing reverence. He was calling for something rarer, simplicity. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. because anything more he said comes from evil." The blind man felt the words settle into him like warm oil. He remembered the lies he had told to protect himself, to win sympathy, to appear strong. Words that shaded truth even just slightly. But now he saw it. In the kingdom, Jesus spoke of truth was not ornamental. It was elemental. Not dressed up in ceremony, but lived in the plain light of honesty. Jesus was showing them something deeper than law. He was revealing the shape of integrity, not a mask we wear in holy places, but a posture of soul even when no one watches. The blind man thought of the boy who had guided him up the hill. The child had asked no reward, made no vow, only offered help and gave it freely. Was this what Jesus meant? Truth so pure it needed no oath. Just presence, just follow through. And as he considered it, another question formed in his heart. What kind of world would this be, if every word was true? And what kind of people must we become for that world to begin? Is it possible that holiness begins not in temples or titles, but in how we speak when no one is listening? Then came the words that froze the air. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. No parable, no metaphor, just the command, naked and impossible. A fisherman turned away, jaw clenched. A zealot near the edge scoffed under his breath. Even the blind man, gentle as he was, felt something in him resist. He had been spat on, tripped in alleys, mocked by children and men alike. He had carried the sting of cruelty in silence. And now loved them. Jesus wasn't asking for tolerance. He was inviting them to become like God. He continued, "Your Father in heaven causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust." The words were not soft. They were holy fire. They burned away every excuse. Because if God gave breath to those who cursed him, how could his children justify revenge? Even the tax collectors love those who love them. Jesus said, "But you be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Perfection, not flawlessness, but wholeness. A heart not divided by vengeance. A life not driven by keeping score. The blind man sat still. He thought of the merchant who once refused him bread. He thought of the rabbi who had declared him cursed. Could he love them? Could he pray for their peace? It felt like death. But maybe that's what love often is. A death to the old self. A surrender to something stronger than pride. A yielding that looks like weakness, but echoes the very heart of heaven. What if your greatest enemy is your greatest opportunity to show the kind of love that can only come from God? The hillside was still, but inside every heart trembled. Then Jesus said something that must have felt like thunder. "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." A gasp moved through the crowd. The Pharisees were the standard, the untouchables. They knew the law, they taught it, they guarded it like treasure. And yet here was this carpenter, this son of a stonemason, saying that their righteousness wasn't enough. The blind man swallowed. He had never memorized scripture. He had never sat beneath a teacher. He had no pedigree, no titles, no rituals to show. And now, this kingdom required something more than the best religion had offered. But then, slowly, he understood. Jesus wasn't raising the ceiling. He was digging deeper. The Pharisees built outward, measured holiness by appearances, posture, reputation. But Jesus, he was after the root. Not how many prayers you speak aloud, but whether those prayers echo with surrender. Not how you give, but whether the gift costs your comfort. This righteousness wasn't performative. It was personal. It bled into thought, motive, desire. It showed up not just at temple, but in kitchen and field, in midnight solitude. And it was not achieved by striving. It began in surrender. The blind man felt a strange hope stirring. Perhaps this wasn't a kingdom for the elite, but for the emptied, for those who knew their own poverty of soul. And maybe, just maybe, that included him. Could it be that the gate to heaven is not guarded by perfection, but opened by humility no one else sees? The words turned now toward devotion. When you give to the needy, Jesus said, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. The blind man felt heat rise in his chest. He had often heard the clink of coins tossed toward beggars, accompanied by long sighs or exaggerated blessings. The givers wanted applause, not mercy. But Jesus was painting a different picture. He spoke of giving in secret, of hands that didn't seek thanks, of generosity that hid itself from glory. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, he said. Then your Father who sees in secret will reward you. That line, your Father who sees in secret, landed deep. It was not just instruction, it was invitation. To a life lived before one pair of eyes only. To actions born not of pressure, but love. The blind man recalled a day long ago when a child had pressed half a loaf of bread into his palm and ran away without a word. That memory, quiet as it was, felt more radiant now than all the loud offerings he had ever received. Jesus was shifting the measure. No longer was holiness defined by display, but by hiddenness, the unseen choice, the silent act, the inner offering that no crowd will ever applaud. The kingdom of heaven did not need a stage. It needed truth, and a heart willing to trust that what the world never sees, God remembers forever. If no one ever knew your kindness, would you still offer it simply because heaven was watching? And when you pray, Jesus continued, do not be like the hypocrites. They love to stand in synagogues and on street corners to be seen by others. The crowd quieted again. They had seen it, those long prayers offered loudly, eyes closed but hearts wide open to applause. But when you pray, he said, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. The blind man imagined it. A room, a door, no audience, just God. This was not a God who needed performance. He was a Father who welcomed presence. Jesus wasn't forbidding public prayer. He was restoring prayer to its rightful place where love, not appearance, was the aim. He then offered words they had never heard before. Our Father who art in heaven. Not my Father, our, not distant, near, not angry, holy. Not waiting to be impressed, but ready to give daily bread, forgiveness, and protection. The blind man swallowed. This was not how he had been taught to pray, but something in him whispered, this is what I've always longed for. Not formulas, not fear, just Father, just trust. And maybe, just maybe, if this kind of intimacy with God was real, then even a blind beggar could draw near. Even silence could be sacred. Even his small stumbling prayers could rise like incense. And if this has stirred something deep within you, something quiet but persistent, don't let it fade. Subscribe to stay close to words that awaken. Share this moment with someone who prays in the dark. Because the kingdom is nearer than we think, and sometimes all it takes is one true prayer whispered in secret. Jesus paused, then turned their eyes to something even more ancient than prayer. Treasure. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he said, where moths and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. A merchant's hand closed around the pouch at his side. A mother glanced at her woven shawl, the last gift of her husband before he died. Jesus was not shaming need. He was naming frailty, the kind of frailty that clings to what can vanish, what can rot, what can be taken in the night. Then he said it, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The blind man felt that line like a chisel in stone. He had little, but he knew the ache of desire. He knew how the soul reached for something, anything, to prove it mattered. A voice, a coin, a blessing. But what if the heart wasn't meant to be chained to things that decay? What if its true home was in heaven? Jesus wasn't warning against beauty. He was calling them to permanence, to invest not in what fills barns, but in what fills eternity. The weight of love, the value of mercy, the gold of unseen obedience. And then the image changed. The eye, he said, is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. The blind man tilted his face upward. He had no eye to offer light, but his heart was beginning to see. This was not about vision. It was about focus, about the inward gaze, about choosing what we fix upon and letting that thing shape our soul. And if our focus is heaven, then maybe even in darkness, we still glow. Could it be that your heart always follows your treasure, not the other way around? And what if that treasure was never meant to rust? Then Jesus said something that sliced through all pretense. No one can serve two masters. You will either hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. And then came the line that silenced the hilltop. You cannot serve both God and money. The crowd shifted. A sandal scraped against stone. The word hung heavy, not as condemnation, but as mirror. The blind man turned it over in his mind. Masters, not bosses, not influences, but lords, rulers of the inner life. Jesus wasn't speaking just about wealth. He was speaking about allegiance, about what claims the throne of the soul. And money, it didn't just buy bread. It bought security, reputation, control. It whispered, if you have enough of me, you don't need him. But Jesus shattered that illusion. Because money demands more than possession. It demands worship. And so does God. But their rewards are not the same. One offers temporary ease and leaves you hungrier. The other offers unseen peace and fills from the inside. The blind man thought of the times he had begged with clenched fists, not for survival, but to feel powerful, if only for a moment. And now the shame of that memory was being turned into light. Because Jesus wasn't just calling the rich to examine their wealth. He was inviting everyone to examine their heart. What did they trust? What did they chase? What did they believe would finally make them safe? And in that moment, a strange new clarity settled over the crowd. You can't build two kingdoms. Only one will last. What if the true test of worship is not the songs we sing, but the master we quietly serve when no one's watching? Then Jesus spoke into the space that money always leaves behind. Worry. Do not worry about your life, he said. What you will eat or drink, or what you will wear. And for a moment it felt impossible. How could they not? A mother counted her coins each morning. A father wondered how long his tools would last. A child went to sleep hearing his parents whisper about debts. But Jesus wasn't ignoring reality. He was revealing something deeper. Look at the birds of the air, he said. They do not sow or reap or store in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. The blind man tilted his head. He had listened to birds more than most. Their songs, their flight, their freedom. And now he saw. Their lives weren't driven by anxiety. They simply lived because they trusted. Jesus continued, are you not much more valuable than they? Not in ability, not in strength, but in belovedness. The Father sees. The Father knows. The Father cares. Not only for the powerful, but for the ones who feel forgotten. The blind man exhaled. Maybe faith didn't mean having the answers. Maybe it meant releasing the fear and beginning again each day from a place of rest. A place called trust. Have you ever felt like the future was too heavy to carry? Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Jesus' words brings you peace? And if you're walking through worry, you're not alone. This space is for you. Do not judge, Jesus said, or you too will be judged. The words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a mirror. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, he added. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The blind man knew what it felt like to be measured. He had heard the whispers. Blind because of sin. Cursed from birth. A burden, not a brother. But now, Jesus was shifting the lens. He spoke of a man trying to remove a speck from his brother's eye, while a plank jutted from his own. The crowd smiled awkwardly. The image was absurd, and yet accurate. Jesus wasn't mocking. He was awakening to the truth that the human heart loves to correct others before examining itself, to the temptation to magnify someone else's flaw and minimize our own fractures. The blind man felt it too. He had judged others in his mind, those who had turned from him, those who had ignored his need. But now he saw. Judgment is not just in words. It is in posture, in tone, in the quiet assumption that I see clearly, when in truth we all walk with dim sight. Jesus said, "First, take the plank out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." He wasn't saying, "Don't correct." He was saying, "Begin with humility. Begin with repentance." Because only the heart that has knelt in need of grace can offer it to others without poison. What if the most powerful act of righteousness is simply admitting where you're still blind? Jesus then turned from warning to promise. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. The words weren't commands. They were invitations. The blind man leaned forward. For years he had asked, but not just for sight, for meaning, for presence, for the simple dignity of being seen. And now Jesus was saying, not once, not politely, but persistently. Not because God is reluctant, but because he is real and responsive. Jesus continued, "For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. To the one who knocks the door will be opened." Then he gave them a picture. If you, being human, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? The blind man felt tears well up. Not for pity, but for the beauty of this truth. God was not a wall to crash against. He was a door waiting to be knocked on. He was not a judge clutching lightning. He was a father with open hands. And asking was not weakness. It was relationship. To seek was to believe that someone waits on the other side. To knock was to hope again, even after silence, even after delay, even after life had not turned out the way one dreamed. The blind man reached inward. Perhaps asking wasn't just for healing. Perhaps it was also the way back to trust. And trust was the soil of prayer. What if the door you stopped knocking on was never locked, only waiting? Jesus then offered a sentence so simple, it could be overlooked. So in everything he said, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. The hillside was silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. It was a line without loopholes. Not don't do harm, but actively do good. The blind man considered it. He thought of every time he had sat by the road hoping someone would stop, hoping someone would speak kindly even if they couldn't give. He remembered the pain of invisibility, and now he imagined, what if he treated others with that same tenderness he had longed for? What if every heart carried that mirror? Jesus was not redefining the law. He was revealing its essence. Love that moved first. Love that imagined the needs of others and stepped toward them. Not out of guilt, but out of kinship. Jesus wasn't building a new religion. He was restoring the ancient intention. A world where compassion leads, where dignity is assumed, where the measure of a person is not their robe or title or speech, but their mercy. And maybe this was the true measure of spiritual maturity. Not how well you perform worship, but how gently you carry the fragile ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who will never repay. The blind man inhaled the still air. It was not too late to begin again. To let the golden rule become more than a phrase. To let it become practice. If this one line truly fulfilled the law and the prophets, what would happen if we lived like it was enough? The silence hung thick now, not heavy with fear, but with decision. Then Jesus said, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." The words landed with weight, not because they were hard to understand, but because they were hard to accept. The blind man had walked many paths, some crowded, some quiet. He knew what it felt like to be pushed aside and to walk alone. But now Jesus was saying that solitude might be a sign of life, not failure. The wide road was easy. It welcomed everything. It asked nothing. It gave the illusion of freedom and ended in ruin. But the narrow road, it was costly. It meant surrender. It meant trust when others mocked you. It meant walking in a direction that felt upside down to the world. Mercy instead of vengeance. Simplicity instead of spectacle. Truth instead of convenience. Love even when unloved. The blind man breathed deeply. He realized the narrow road wasn't just about where you walked. It was about how, with whom, and for whom. Jesus wasn't describing a hidden trail. He was describing a transformed life, one choice, one step at a time. And in that moment, the blind man no longer feared being different. Because maybe different was holy, if the road you're on feels lonely. Could it be because it was never meant to be popular but faithful? Watch out for false prophets, Jesus warned. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. The blind man listened carefully. He had heard many voices over the years, voices that spoke of God, but carried no love, voices that used fear to control, voices that offered religion, but no healing. And now, Jesus was lifting the veil. He wasn't warning against outsiders. He was warning against those who looked the part, those who used the right language, wore the right robes, held the right scrolls, but whose hearts were hungry not to serve, but to feed on others. He continued, "By their fruit you will recognize them, not their words, not their titles. Their fruit, not how they sound in the temple, but how they live when no one is watching." The blind man thought of a time when a priest had stepped over him to get to prayer. No cruelty, no insult, just absence. And that somehow had hurt more. Because indifference wounds. Jesus was calling for discernment, not suspicion, but eyes that see beyond the surface. He said, "Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes? Every good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit." It was not a riddle. It was reality. He wasn't telling them to judge harshly. He was teaching them to see clearly, and perhaps to ask the hardest question of all. Not just, what kind of fruit do others bear? But, what kind of fruit do I? If all titles were stripped away, what kind of tree would your life reveal? Then came the words that stung deeper than warning. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. A cold stillness passed through the crowd. The blind man's breath caught. He had heard many say, "Lord." He had whispered it himself. But Jesus was not asking for repetition. He was calling for reality, obedience, surrender. A life aligned, not just a tongue that repeats holy words. He went on, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Did we not prophesy in your name, drive out demons, perform miracles?' And then, the hardest line of all, then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" The blind man sat motionless. He had no miracles to present, no great deeds, just faith and silence. But maybe that was enough. Because Jesus wasn't impressed by power. He was looking for relationship, not a resume of religious acts, but a heart that listened, that obeyed when no one saw, that loved God not for reward, but because he is worthy. And perhaps the true measure of knowing him is not how loudly we say his name, but how deeply we live it. The blind man tilted his head toward heaven. If God was looking not for performance, but for presence, then maybe even the unnoticed could be known. And maybe the door wasn't opened by volume, but by trust. When you stand before God, will you present what you've done or who you've become? And then Jesus gave them a story, not a riddle, not a parable for the scholars, a picture. Clear, earthy, undeniable. "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice," he said, "is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." The blind man pictured it. The sound of hammer against stone, the weight of each brick, the slow, patient labor, not glamorous, but enduring. Then the storm came. Rain, wind, floods. The kind of storm that pulls at the seams of everything you thought would hold. But the house stood, because it had been built on something deeper than weather. Jesus wasn't just talking about construction. He was talking about life, about how we build when no one is looking, about what we stand on when everything else begins to fall apart. He wasn't asking for speed. He was asking for substance. The crowd listened. Some eyes were wet with quiet recognition, because they had built their lives on sand, approval, comfort, control. And now they heard the offer, another foundation, a quieter one, but stronger. Jesus was not impressed by hearers. He longed for builders. He was not collecting fans. He was forming citizens, and the kingdom he spoke of, it wasn't made with words. It was built stone by stone with obedience. What if the storm is not your enemy, but the only thing honest enough to show you what you've really built? But everyone who hears these words of mine, Jesus said, and does not put them into practice, is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The blind man could feel the shift. Same story, same storm, same structure on the outside. But beneath, everything was different. One had depth. The other had appearance. Jesus wasn't condemning mistakes. He was confronting pretense, because it's easy to admire truth and never let it shape you. It's easy to nod at wisdom and still live unchanged. And when the storm came for the foolish man's house, it didn't just leak. It collapsed. Completely. Not because the house was weak, but because the foundation was missing. The blind man sat very still. He knew what it meant to rely on others, to lean on what couldn't hold, to build dreams on the approval of crowds. But now he heard something else. Storms don't wait for the strong. They come for everyone. The difference is not in the rain, it's in the root. And Jesus was not speaking with anger. He was pleading with tenderness. He was saying, don't just listen. Build. Don't just admire the view. Dig. Because what you build your life on will one day be revealed. And that day won't be decided by comfort, but by truth. And when the wind screams and the water rises, it will be too late to dig. If today is your calm, is it time to check what's beneath your peace? The hillside grew still. The echo of Jesus' words slowly faded, but their weight remained. Not as sound, but as substance. The blind man didn't speak. He didn't need to, because something had already been spoken inwardly. The people around him shifted. Some eyes lowered. Some hearts stirred. Because for all their years of Torah, for all their hours in the synagogue, they had never heard teaching like this. Matthew would later write, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. It was not volume. It was truth. It was not emotion. It was eternity. And now the crowd had a choice, not to remember what he said, but to respond, not to admire the sermon, but to let it break ground in them. The blind man felt the breeze shift. The sky was softening, but his heart was opening. Because the question was no longer, did you hear the words? It was, will you build with them? Not someday, but now. Because storms don't come with warnings, and houses don't stand by luck, only by love. Turned into action, only by truth. Driven into stone. When the crowd disperses and the hillside grows quiet, what will remain standing in you? The crowd began to move. Some slow heads bowed, some whispering, unsure what to do with what they'd heard. And the blind man remained seated. He wasn't ready to leave, because something had changed, not around him, within. The hillside that once echoed with Jesus' voice now fell into sacred quiet. But the silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. The sermon had ended, but its call had not. Jesus had not asked them to believe in a theory. He had invited them into a kingdom, not built with walls, but with hearts, not seen in temples, but in choices made when no one claps. And now, Every person had a decision. Would they return to the familiar, or step toward the unknown? Would they keep their robes clean and minds full of law, or let the Spirit write something new within them? The blind man's world had always been darkness, but somehow now he saw not light, but truth. And truth, he realized, was not meant to be admired. It was meant to be followed, stone by stone, act by act, one small obedience at a time. The hillside was behind them now, but the kingdom, it was still calling. And what about you? What will you carry down from this hill? A memory or a mission? As he rose from the ground, the blind man didn't feel taller. He felt rooted, like something had anchored deep inside. Jesus had not laid hands on him that day. No clay, no miracle, no crowd gasping in wonder. And yet, a healing had begun, one deeper than sight. A healing of the will, of the trust that had been shattered by silence and now restored by truth. Jesus had given no list, no steps, only a way, a narrow path, but a living one. And now the blind man carried not a sermon, but a seed of kingdom truth, not loud, but alive. Because the words of Jesus didn't just explain life, they created it, in the hearts that received them, in the hands that began to live them out, in the forgiveness that felt impossible but now felt necessary, in the courage to walk away from the crowd, not in rebellion but in response. And the man thought, what if every act of mercy, every quiet choice for righteousness was a blossom? What if the real miracle was not instant change, but a field slowly blooming because someone chose to believe? He stepped forward, still blind in the body, but seeing now in soul. And the question wasn't, when will I see, but how will I walk? If the word has been planted in you, will you let it bloom? Or will you bury it under the noise of life? The sun was nearly gone now. Its last light lingered on the rocks and olive leaves like a blessing resting before vanishing. The hillside emptied, but one truth remained. This sermon was never meant to stay on a mount. It was always meant to walk off the hill and enter us, not as memory, but as movement, not as poetry, but as practice. The blind man paused. He could not describe the face of Jesus, but he could feel his voice still ringing inside. And maybe that was the point. Jesus did not come to make us remember him, but to become like him, to be salt where bitterness grows, to be light where shadow wins, to hunger not for applause, but for righteousness, to build not fast, but deep. And now the world waits for those who have heard, for those who will live it, not louder, but truer, not bigger, but braver. You've listened to the sermon. You've climbed the hill. Now the question is no longer what you believe, but what you will become. And if you're still here, still listening, it means your heart has stayed open. So let these words take root. Let them disturb, heal, awaken. And if something sacred stirred in you, if a seed was planted, let it grow and walk with us. There's more ahead, more stories to unfold, more words that breathe, more storms and more stone. If this journey meant something to you, share it. And if you want to keep building on the rock, stay. Subscribe. Let's walk the narrow road together.